just a warning, this episode deals with some of Australia's biggest court cases and there are a lot of details. So if you have little ears around, maybe save this one until later. I'm Mia Friedman and you're listening to the No Filter podcast, real stories about real people that you won't be able to stop listening to. True crime podcasts have become really huge in the last few years and my guest today has pretty much lived inside one for the last 10 years. She's not a judge though, and she's not a lawyer, and she's certainly not a serial criminal. Jamelle Wells is in fact a court reporter, and since 2008 she's been working for the ABC covering some of the biggest and most famous criminal cases in the country. She covered the Robert Hughes case, the Hey Dad star who was convicted of sexual offences against children, and she covered the Lindt Cafe siege inquest, which went on for months. Jamelle has spent hundreds and thousands of hours sitting just metres from criminals and from their victims, and also the families of those whose lives have been ended in the most dramatic and horrible ways. So what's it like inside the courtroom when you're sitting so close to people who've been accused of the most heinous things? And has the pop culture obsession with true crime changed the way that Jamelle reports? And how does she close her eyes and go to sleep at the end of the day after everything she's heard at work? Here's Jamelle Wells. Jamelle, it's so interesting in your book. You do seem to be able to be remarkably detached, but I imagine that's not always the case because you are flesh and blood and human. What are some of the cases that have most stayed with you?
I think, Mia, anything to do with children. No crime can be justified, but I can sort of understand how adults get into a fit of rage or commit a crime of passion or, want revenge on another adult. It doesn't excuse it, but you can see how people's ego takes over and they just do these silly things. But in my mind, children, the elderly, animals, people who can't defend themselves, who are the most vulnerable. And a couple that really have stuck with me. One has been the murderer Robert Z, who murdered 5 members of his own family. And, of course, we heard in court that he crept into their family home late at night and beat them all to death with a hammer-like object. And the judge said in sentencing him to 5 life sentences, she said the 2 little boys that he killed would have known their attacker, and there was evidence that they had some sort of struggle, so they were trying to run away from him in the house. That sticks with me. There was another case I covered once. It was a Cowra grandfather, John Walsh, who murdered his wife, murdered his 2 grandchildren, and then murdered the family dog after he'd killed everybody else. And it was just a bizarre thing to do. But once again, defenceless little kids who were related to him.
And you wrote in the book that the court went very quiet when the evidence was given about him murdering the dog. It's those little moments that, I can't imagine sitting in court and hearing the details that we often won't hear as consumers of media because they're not appropriate to be on an afternoon radio show or on the nightly news. How do you know what you can say and what you can't? And how do you process the stuff that you can't?
I wish it was an exact science, Mia, but it's not. It's a balancing act. Every story I file, I have to think about the audience. And as a court reporter, it's important to me to get all the facts out there because to sanitise it is to somehow let someone off, I think, in a way for what they've done. But you do have to think about those things, just how much can people hear. And sometimes we put a warning at the start of stories. We'll say, a warning, this story contains graphic images of something. And people have a different response to that. Like some people think it highly inappropriate, and that is fair enough. So
to warn people that it's highly inappropriate.
Yeah. And I think that it's always a juggling act. It's always a balancing act for all of the media. It's my job to get it right and to be as objective as I can. So I guess like a judge or a police officer or a doctor or someone who deals with quite intense stuff every day, I just try to step back and report the facts. And that means I might think someone's guilty or I think someone's a horrid person for having done what they've done, but it's up to me to present their case as well. So the defence case has to be presented. People often ask me, do I take this home with me? Do I go home and worry about these cases and think about them? I think it would be inhuman not to. We all do that as reporters and journalists, things we see. But I have a switch-off mechanism in that I step back and I think these are the facts and this is one person. It's not all of the world. The world is not an entirely bad place. This is just one person who, for whatever reason, has chosen to do this. So I do think about some cases I've covered, but also I think, well, that's done. They've been sentenced. The courts have dealt with them. On to the next one. It doesn't mean I don't care, but if I took every case home every night, I'd have nothing else to think about. And I'm very lucky in that I've got a lovely family and friends and life outside of the media. So I don't want to go home and talk about court cases all day and all night. But there have been some cases we've covered where we'll be up quite late at night, or the media who've reported on some of these cases, and we'll be talking to each other about them or texting or phoning as a sort of a debrief.
So people from different media organisations, because no one else heard what you heard today, you can't necessarily, go out for dinner with a girlfriend and go, hey, this thing happened.
Yeah, no, that's true. So that's really important. We'll quite often talk about it after a case.
As a debriefing.
As a debriefing, yeah. And I think I learnt that very early on in the round. You need to talk about it very quickly and move on to the next story, or step back and be quite objective about it. It's hard, though, when you're sitting in the public gallery with the family of someone who's been murdered, for example, and a lot of the time I'm doing that, or I'll have grieving relatives approach me outside court with photos of their loved ones who've been murdered or who are missing, and that's really hard because they're very real people, and some people never move on.
Tell me for a moment, walking into that court case, when you walk into any courtroom, who's there? Who do you see? Set the scene a little bit for someone who's never been in a court before.
Okay, so it's different with every court that you're in, but for some, like a big murder trial like that one, for example, you'll go in and there'll be the accused in the dock, which is the loneliest place, I think, to be in any courtroom, to be accused of a crime and just sitting in the dock on your own. Then in front of you is the judge with a couple of helpers, a judge's associate and a court staff member. Then there's a jury box.
And is the judge in the robes and the wig and everything?
Yeah, the judge wears the full wig and the long flowing red robe, and there's a knock-knock before the judge enters. And
what's a knock-knock?
One of the court officials will, and the court rises, so we all stand to acknowledge the law and the process that's going to go on in the court. So the judge will come in and sit down, and in the public gallery could be family members of the accused, it could be members of the victims' families, it could be just general public, and quite often the public gallery is just full of the general public.
Tell me about the general public who go to trials. Is there a group of regulars?
Oh, there are, and this is one thing that took my eye from one of the early days. I started reporting on courts. I would go along to these big murder trials and I would think, who are all these people? And over the years I got to know some of them, and there are some lovely, intelligent, incredibly intuitive, sympathetic people who just love following these court cases, but there's also some real nutters as well. Now, a lovely couple I met following the Gordon Wood trial, these two fellows called Robin and Dennis, and they met during the Gordon Wood trial. They hit it off straight away and became each other's special person for about 20 years, and they were following these court cases for a long time. And Dennis passed away, I think, at the age of, in his late 80s, and Robin still comes to court on his own all the time now. And people would speculate that they were retired lawyers or something like that, but they weren't. They were both semi-retirees who just found the legal process fascinating. So they would come to court every day together. And there was one fellow who actually was impersonating a solicitor, and I used to see this young man, very well dressed, running around after all the barristers offering to carry their bags. And I thought, this is a very ambitious young law student and he'll go far, And then one of the barristers took me aside one day and he said, no, Jamelle, he said, that guy's actually about to be charged with impersonating a solicitor and giving out fake cards. He was pretending to be so he got charged. He's still around the courts. And when you think about it, we have this fascination with crime, and everything on TV is about crime or some sort of police series, and I think that spills over into real life. People say, oh, that's a really horrible, violent case, but they want to know the details. It has this mystery, this intrigue for them, and I think in some ways they want to know they kind of like to see justice played out, and they want some sort of reassurance that the legal system is in place and it is doing the right thing.
What have you observed over years of watching the families of victims attend trials of their accused murderers?
I think the judges do a very good job of trying to make it easy for accused and victims' family members. They give them that warning that I mentioned.
And do most of them take that up and leave, or most of them feel that they have to pay respect?
I think a lot of them feel that they have to pay respect. That's a lovely way to put it. And quite often they're quite overpowered by the evidence and they have to leave anyway. One example of that was during the trial for Matthew Milat, one of the Milat family members who was convicted. He was a young man who we were allowed to name. The judge gave us permission to name him.
He was the nephew of Ivan Milat?
Ivan Milat, the serial killer, yeah. And he was found guilty of murdering a young man, David Octoloni, by luring him to the Belanglo State Forest.
It was a mate of his, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So it was like a thrill killing?
Yeah, it was, and that's exactly how the judge described it. She said it was a thrill kill, and then basically hacking him to death with an axe and videoing it. Someone actually videoed it on their mobile phone. And the judge said, look, we're about to play a recording of it, so I'm giving you that warning if you want to leave. And the family members chose not to leave, and it was quite chilling because in court, when the recording was played, you could actually hear the victim begging for his life. And I remember that day, some people in the public gallery started to cry. It was such disturbing evidence. But I think the judges do try very hard. I think personally as a reporter, I think most reporters do this, we try very hard too. Our job is to get comment from people outside the court, and sometimes that's perceived as being predatory or chasing people, but it's a very fine line we tread. You know, we want to tell their story as well, so we want to give them the right to say something. Sometimes they do get upset by being approached by the media, so sometimes you know when to back off. And personally,
how can you tell? How do you decide?
Look, personally, I think if it's not a person on trial for something, if they're not the accused and they're visibly upset by a media presence and they don't want to talk, I think it's time to maybe step back and leave them alone. And when you think about it, it must be petrifying for anyone to walk into a court and see not only us, but all the court watchers, a public gallery full of strangers, and thinking, what have they got to do with my personal family life? Because a court case lays everything bare. You hear all sorts of evidence and witness statements. It's very, very harrowing process. And you mentioned before about seeing justice served and getting closure. Well, I sometimes wonder, even when someone's found guilty or given a hefty jail sentence, is that really any closure for the family? They're never going to get their loved one back, you know. And sometimes these court cases cripple people financially. They're emotionally draining. For example, it can take years for a court case to even get off the ground. So for someone to have to take time off work on and off over a 1 or 2 year period before a trial even gets underway, it's a huge economic and emotional cost. And I actually found that out on a very minor scale myself firsthand. I had a stalker who caused a lot of trouble for me, and I had to go to court to get a apprehended violence order taken out against him.
So this was just someone who was following your reporting and just became fixated and wanted to tell you things. How did it start?
Yeah, okay, so he used to watch the ABC News channel, and it was at the time when all these ICAC inquiries were on, and so he would see me doing that, and he found out where I lived, and he would stick notes on my door, all sorts of hot tips for the ICAC. And at first it was harmless, but then it stepped up a notch, and one day I came home from work and he was swinging a samurai sword around in my car park downstairs. And another day, it was a Saturday morning, he somehow talked his way into the foyer of my building and was kicking at my front door because I wouldn't let him in. So I called the police. I called them many times, but usually when they came, he was gone. And anyway, to sum it up, we got to court, and the magistrate called us both down the front of the room, and she said I had to stand next to him. And I remember standing there thinking for the first time, now I know why some domestic violence victims or victims of assaults actually drop court cases or don't go to court in the first place. You often hear from police prosecutors that someone will drop a case or they won't testify, and it's really hard for them because they might think they've got a good case, but it's harrowing for the person having to do it. And I understood for the first time. I thought, wow, now I know why people do it. Anyway,
the emotional vulnerability as well as the physical vulnerability to have to stand in court with someone who you're scared of. That's why you're in court.
That's right.
But why would the judge do that?
Well, it is quite common in those local courts for magistrates to do that. In a lot of court cases, rape victims and victims of sexual assault, for example, can give evidence via video link. But quite often in those matters, you are in court with the person who you're accusing of doing something. I mean, I had people with me. I wasn't there on my own, but it was still quite confronting to do that. And the whole process dragged on for a day, and we were sitting there thinking, I'm not at work, I want to go back
I need to be in a different court, not
yes,
this one.
That's right. And anyway, this fellow annoyed the poor magistrate so much. The police had asked for an AVO for 1 year, and she was so annoyed with him by the end of it, she enforced it for 2 years. And I just remember leaving the court and he was screaming at the court officers, "This never happened the last time someone took out an AVO against me." It was,
oh my God.
I laugh at it now, but it wasn't funny at the time.
No. Some of the cases you cover are low profile and some are very high profile. Robert Hughes, the Hey Dad actor, that was accused of sexually abusing a number of women.
That's right.
Tell me what kind of a circus that was and what that was like to cover.
That was a circus in that there were a lot of people in the public gallery most days, and Robert Hughes was on bail, so he used to come and go from the court throughout his trial, and of course he was eventually convicted and jailed, and the day that he was found guilty, he shouted out in the court, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. He still maintains he's innocent even though he hasn't been granted the right to appeal yet. Quite often during that trial, school groups would come into the courtroom. It was down at the Downing Centre, and it tends to attract a lot of school excursions, and they would come in at really inappropriate times when victims were giving evidence, which was quite unusual. I mean, the teachers would then get them out pretty quickly, but that was one aspect of it. Another day, it was quite strange. We were waiting out the front of the court to get pictures of Robert Hughes as he came in, and this fellow was standing out the front of the court spitting into a cup, and it was about half full of saliva. And I said to him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm going to keep spitting in here until he comes out, and then I'm going to throw it all over him." And I said, "Do you know him? Are you a relative of one of the victims? What's your story?" And he said, No, I just think he's a low life and I want to do this." So I actually told the court officers, a few reporters, and they asked him to move on because it was busy enough as it was. But court cases can attract that sort of element sometimes. People who maybe have a grudge to bear or an axe to grind. But
there's something about people accused of crimes against children that does, incite people's deep passions. And from what I understand, he's copped a far worse version of that in prison repeatedly, Robert Hughes, since he's been in there.
That's right. His lawyer has said quite often, talking to the media, that he's not done very well in jail at all, that because of his high profile, he's a target. He's had lots of things thrown at him. He's had to be kept in isolation. And he was very well known, very famous before. And this was a very drawn-out process because the crimes he's jailed for committing took place a long time ago. He went to live in London. He was extradited, brought back to Australia, and was on our TV screens for years. Everybody knew who he was. And some of his victims gave evidence via video link. Some chose to give evidence in person. And part of the defence case was that some of them had given paid television interviews in the past, and that had prejudiced them, and that if Robert Hughes was not so high profile, he wouldn't have copped this sort of attention and people wouldn't have been out to get him. But what was very interesting about this trial too was that some of the witnesses gave what's called tendency evidence. That is, they weren't victims, but they were people giving evidence about the way he behaved. And the allegation was that this pattern of behaviour sort of helped prove that he did what he did to these young girls.
And what was some of the tendency evidence?
Well, they were saying things like they saw him doing things in the television studio, or exposing himself, or lying around without clothes on and evidence of that nature. But Robert Hughes said it was a TV studio. I was getting changed. I didn't do that. So that was his defence.
So it all comes down to very much one person trying to prove the other person's a liar, right?
Yeah.
And that must be very distressing for victims who are who've already experienced something traumatic. And I interviewed on No Filter one of his victims, Sarah Monahan, who was very brave and courageous in coming forward. And it's taken a great toll on her, as it has on every victim of sexual abuse or assault. What's the process of watching someone go on the stand and tell their story, and someone actually, it's their job to try to accuse them of being a liar and break them down? I mean, what are they trying to do? Get them to break down? Or is that seen as a bad thing because that'll make the jury more sympathetic to them? Can you talk a little bit about the process of watching victims being interrogated? I guess that's all. Cross-examined is probably the technical term.
Yeah, and it is a little bit like an audience watching too, because I see a courtroom as a little theatre in a way. It is very tough watching the defence lawyers question people, but that's their job. And some people are better prepared for it than others. Some victims give evidence, and then sometimes there are witnesses that a lawyer might try to discredit as well. So say I'm charging someone with an offence against me, you might be my witness. So you will stand up and you'll say, oh yes, I saw that person do that to Jamelle, and then the lawyer will try and make you seem like
poke holes
an idiot
in my argument.
So they can be very, very tough, but that's their job. And it's interesting because...
Is their job to get them to break down?
It's their job to disprove their evidence or to find holes in their evidence. And it's very tough sometimes because in cases where it's just circumstantial evidence, just hearsay, for example, we don't have photos of someone doing something or CCTV vision or recording or something like that. If the offence has been committed a long time ago, memory changes. So I might remember something one way and you'll remember it another. So
that was the case with Robert Hughes, where he tried to say it didn't happen this way, it happened that way.
That's right, yeah. And he said that he knew these children, that he worked with some of them, he was friendly with them, but he said that he never did anything inappropriate to them. And he said because some of his victims knew him through their families, and he went to functions at his house and vice versa, or they were at social outings together, and he said, yes, I was friendly, or I might have put my hand on them and hugged them or something, but I didn't indecently assault them. So watching some of the witnesses give evidence at his trial, I thought they were very, very courageous. Sarah Monahan, I thought, was amazing. She stood up to that interrogation very, very well.
She's fierce.
Yeah, she's very, very determined, and that would be very hard. I've also seen older people do this too. One case was a very brave woman called Caroline de Wagener, and you might remember that Dr. Graham Reeves, who was actually put in jail for performing inappropriate surgeries on female
He cut off her clitoris,
patients.
didn't he?
Yeah. And a lot
when he was meant to be doing a hysterectomy?
He was meant to be removing a cancerous lesion. And what we were told by police was that a lot of his victims actually dropped the charges because it was too harrowing to go to court. And
imagine.
Yeah, and this woman was so brave. She would have been aged in her maybe 50s, early 60s when she gave her evidence, and she gave permission for us to name her. That's why we can name her. And I used to go and sit in the court foyer down at the Downing Centre each day, and she would be sitting where you are now, and he would be sitting near her reading a book, waiting to go into the court. How she sat there, I really don't know. She was a very brave woman and so articulate in the witness box, and we were wondering, the reporters in court were wondering how long she would hold up to the questioning that she was subjected to, but she was just very calm and she kept stating what happened. He was eventually convicted and given a short jail sentence, but released on appeal because he had health issues. But there were, as I mentioned, there were a lot of people who came forward and laid charges, and then the DPP dropped a lot of those charges. And we will never know the exact details why, but hearsay from family members is that it was just too tough. And he was working in very small country towns, so in those sorts of cases I've noticed over the years where people know everyone, they're less likely to come forward because it's something everyone's going to talk about, and you walk down the street and people know who you are, whereas you live in a city, you can be a little more anonymous.
Families of victims aren't always united in their behaviour and their feelings after a case, are they? I'm thinking again of the Lynn family murder.
That's right. Well, Robert Z is serving 5 life sentences for murdering 5 members of his own family, and what we heard during his trials, he stood trial several times.
Now, why is that? Because that just seemed to go on and on and on.
It did. It went for years. Well, he was arrested, charged, went through a committal hearing, and then his first trial was aborted because new evidence came to hand. Second trial was aborted because the judge got sick. Third trial ended in a hung jury. Fourth trial, he was found guilty.
Oh, my goodness.
And the fourth trial went for about 6 months. So it's a story that I followed for, it seemed to be years and years and years.
So how many, just let me ask, of all of those days, so say each trial went for a number of months, it's probably like 2 years in total that those trials went for. When you cover a trial, you're not there every day necessarily, are you? Or are you?
Well, most of the days, in that you assess when the high-profile witnesses will be up, or crucial witnesses. Some days during a long trial like that, the last Robert Z trial, for example, that went for 6 months. Some days it might just be legal argument, for example, and what that means
about whether a piece of evidence can be admitted.
Yeah. So that's sort of stuff that's talked about, not in front of the jury, so we can't report on it. So there might be 2 or 3 days of that. Or a juror might be sick one day, so they'll all go home at 11 o'clock and it won't sit that day. It will resume the next day or something like that.
But do you have to report on something every single day for 6 months?
If you're following the trial for 6 months, some days it's not reportable. It might be, for example, something that's suppressed, but you have to sit through it because
why
you
are
have
things
to
suppressed?
Hear it. Well, it could be that it's evidence involving a child or a victim of a sexual assault or something like that, or to protect someone's identity. It could be, for example, a prisoner who's rolled over in jail or something, or it could be children who live next door to where the murder occurred or something like that. So they're there giving evidence, but their identity's suppressed. So
you can't report. You can't even say a child or a witness.
Sometimes no. Yeah, sometimes no. The suppressions will vary. Like the judge will make differing orders, and sometimes those orders will be lifted after a trial is finished. So something that I know for the whole trial I can't tell you, when it's all over, the suppression will be lifted and suddenly I can report on it. So,
which is relevant to this case.
Yeah. Well, what happened with the Z case, Robert Z, the Crown argued, waited until the oldest Lynn child, Brenda, was overseas on a school excursion, and then he crept into the family home at night and murdered the other 5 family members. And the case was that that's because he had a sexual interest in her, that he was sexually abusing her. And we couldn't.
He was her uncle.
He was her uncle, yeah, and we couldn't report that. We knew it, well, we heard it at the trial, but we couldn't report it. But after he was convicted and given those 5 life jail sentences, she actually came forward and gave permission for it all to be reported and to be identified. And she was in court the day that he was sentenced, just with a group of friends, and she could have been any young person on a day out shopping or something. She just looked like such a normal young lady, but incredibly brave and courageous for coming forward, because if she hadn't have come forward, the case would not have been as strong against him. And
because the motive, the initial motive was a little bit shaky, that he was a bit jealous of his brother-in-law who owned the newsagent.
That's right. The Crown was that Robert Z was a trained ear, nose, and the Crown case, I should say, was that Robert Z was a trained ear, nose and throat surgeon, and that he hadn't worked much when he moved to Australia, and he was jealous of his brother-in-law, Norman Lynn, who ran a successful news agency at Epping. That was the case.
And Norman Lynn and Robert Z were married to sisters. Is that right?
Yeah. Okay, so Norman Lynn was Robert Z's brother-in-law, and so Robert Z murdered him, his wife's sister, and their 2 young children. Yeah.
So throughout the trial, the parents of Robert Z's wife and Norman Lynn, who had lost their whole family except for their daughter, who was married to the man that was accused of killing the rest of their family, they sided very much against Robert Z, but his wife stayed loyal to him the whole time. Is that right?
That's right.
And went against her own parents.
That's right. And they would come to court and sit in opposite sides of the public gallery. It was incredible to watch it. And they would come with photos of the slain grandchildren. Kathy Lynn would bring Robert Z lunch every day in court. And she used to sit next to me. I like to sit up the back of the court because it lets me get in and out quickly. But she would sit next to me at the back of the court, and she'd bring in lunch for him and go and hand it to the court officers. And the day that he was sentenced, she sat right up near him in the dock and then just burst into tears after the judge gave him the 5 life sentences. And outside she said, he's innocent. She said, Robert did not kill the Lynn family. We're preparing an appeal and he's not guilty. She stuck by him all along. And what the judge said in sentencing him was the night that he crept out to commit the murders, she said Kathy Lynn was either asleep or that she was drugged. The prosecutors had argued that he'd somehow drugged her, and the judge said, I can't be sure of that. She wasn't accused of being involved in them, but she did stick by him.
As did Robert Hughes' wife.
That's right.
Yeah, Robin Gardner.
That's right.
So how does that work? You know, you watch them come to court every day. You see them sitting in the courtroom listening to this horrific evidence that obviously piles up and piles up. I know you can't speak for them, but do you watch? You've watched it enough times play out. Do sometimes you see them going, right, I'm out of here, and other times they just seem completely blinkered in their loyalty and their support?
Look, why they stick by these people are only for reasons that they will know and understand. Maybe they do really believe that they are innocent. And sometimes when you're dealing with these high-profile people, the defence case is that their high profile makes them a target. You know, that all sorts of nutters and people who will make up stories and lies are attracted to trying to find something against this person or using them as a whipping person sort of thing.
Or that these people are doing it for the fame and the money. Yeah. The accusers are somehow doing it for the fame and the money. Yeah. You've seen this play out a lot. Is there a lot of fame and money in accusing people of committing heinous crimes?
I don't think there's much money in it. There's maybe a little bit of fame, but maybe for the wrong reasons.
Infamy,
yeah. And having your photo splashed all over a court case or, you know, on a TV screen because you're involved in a court case, I don't think is a very good thing. And because it also opens up the door for these people's lives to be, you know, shown publicly in every little detail that they might not want.
For every court case you decide to cover, there are others that you can't. How do you make those decisions every day?
Look, that's the $1 million question. And I think to be a court reporter, you're always sort of working in a mild case of anxiety, and then you're thinking, is there a better story down the road? You know, I hope I'm at the right one. I think you have to gauge your audience and how much it's in the public interest. If it's a high-profile person or a politician, or if the crime is one that's really quite shocking and prolific. But equally, there are a lot of things that we cover people think we shouldn't. A lot of people think that there are cases that the media doesn't cover that should be reported on. So I wish I had a right answer for you. I think there's a balance. It's a fine balancing act. And there have been times in my newsroom where there have been so many, for example, cases of children being neglected or abused. We've looked at the storyboard and we've gone, there are 8 cases today. Which do we cover? And that's really sad sort of indictment on our society. But it's true. At any given day, there might be numerous
So what
instances.
Makes you decide? How do you decide which of those 8 is going to make the best story or is going to be the most important one for you to cover?
Probably personally for me, it would be the crime that was, or the alleged crime that was perhaps the most prolific, if it involved a lot of charges or a public figure, a high-profile public figure, and if it was a trial actually opening. Those eight stories might be, some of those cases might be in their very early days, which means they're not quite at trial yet. If it was a sentence or a judgment, like a case being finalised, I might think, okay, there's going to be a judgment today, I'll report on that.
So sometimes you'll come in at the end, you won't have gone all the way through.
Sometimes we'll have dipped in and out of a case, and that is the great sadness about being a court reporter. Some cases you can follow every day because your newsroom allows you to do that. If there are many different cases on at once that are all high profile, sometimes I can't do that. So I'll have to cover your court case for 5 days or go in and out of it, another one in the same way. And that makes it really hard to do the job because you're coming in halfway through something sometimes and you're catching up. You're trying to work out what's gone on before. Look, there's so many thousands of cases each day as well. You could cover them all and you know, where would you put all the stories?
In this book.
Yeah.
What about your relationship? I wanted to ask you about your relationship with Louisa Hope, who you met through the Sydney Siege inquest.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about that trial? And well, that was an inquest, not a trial, because the accused was dead.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about Louisa.
Okay, so Louisa Hope, we know, was one of the victims of the Sydney Siege inquest when Manharon Monis went into the Lint Cafe and held people hostage overnight. And an inquest was held into his death and the death of cafe manager Tori Johnson and Katrina Dawson, the barrister who died after being hit by police shrapnel. And during the inquest, which was held at the John Maddison Towers behind the Downing Centre, Louisa Hope was one of the witnesses. And she would come in to court every day, and even days when she wasn't giving evidence. And at the time, my mother was living with me, who had been diagnosed with terminal breast cancer. And so my mum was at home watching TV. She would watch me be standing in the gutter outside the court doing crosses on the siege inquest every day. And I'd go home at night and look after her and talk to her, and we'd do things together. And Louisa Hope gave evidence at the inquest that she was in the cafe with her mother when this crazy man Monis came in and took all the hostages, and we heard that she actually could have gotten out. There were opportunities when Louisa could have run out the door, but she didn't go because her mother couldn't run with her. She stayed, and right at the end they were used as human shields by this gunman, and he had both of these women around him, and when he shot Tori Johnson in the back of the head, when he executed him at point blank range, they were standing right near him, so they saw that whole thing. So Louisa, lovely, compassionate woman, sought me out and we would talk during most days of evidence. And one day we were chatting away about caring for elderly mothers because our mothers were the same age, and I told her my mum was dying, and the next day Louisa came in and she bought cards for people who specialised in managing chronic pain. One was an acupuncturist, I think, and she would always come and talk to me and ask how my mum was doing, and we'd swap notes about caring for elderly mums. And I remember thinking, Mia, how incredibly kind she was in that she was in that witness box one day giving evidence about how she'd nearly died, and it was quite traumatic for her, and yet she would come back the next day and talk to me, a complete stranger, and ask how my mum was doing, and just the kindness that she showed me blew me away, like an incredibly kind lady. And then at the end of the inquest, I remember by the time I reported on the coroner's findings, my mum had passed away, and Louisa was back in court for the findings with her mum. And for me then, that was the missing link that day. I saw her with her mum, and then I had to go outside the court and talk about the inquest findings. And I thought, oh, my mum's not at home watching me on the TV anymore. So it was quite an emotional thing to do. But what that woman went through and the way she's come out of it, totally grounded, very gracious, very showing a lot of gratitude for the good things in her life. And I watched those witnesses, some of the siege hostages, and I would sit there and watch them in the witness box and think, how will you ever get over this? How will this change you? And some of them did come across to me as being very broken and very damaged. Others seemed quite grounded and as though they were going to use this as a stepping stone to come back, stronger and not let it keep them down. But you couldn't go through something like that without having without being changed or damaged somehow. But Manharon Monis, it's interesting you should mention that inquest, because I had followed him for years before the Sydney siege.
Really? You knew him? Well, you knew of him?
Yeah, I had followed his various court cases. I first met him when he was in court for sending threatening letters to the families of dead Australian soldiers. And what he'd done, he'd sent these poison pen letters to them saying that the soldiers were terrorists and that they deserved to die, and that the family members needed to bring up their children differently. It was really quite horrible. And the first day I met him at the Downing Centre Court, we came out of court and he chained himself up to the steps of the Downing Centre. He put all these chains around his neck, and I went up and talked to him, and he loved the attention of the media. And he said to me, my pen is a sword, and he said it's a peace weapon, and I write these letters because I want peace, because I want Australia to pull out of Afghanistan, and all this stuff he was going on with.
Was he crazy?
Look, to be honest, at the time, I thought he was, and I misjudged him. I didn't think that he would turn out to be a violent person. I thought he was just a little crazy. And he chained himself up until about 6 o'clock at night. I went back the next day. He was back there again. And I said, so what do you think of the police fans over there watching you? And he said, they're there for my protection. And it was on Remembrance Day, the next day that he did it. And he was convinced that police were there protecting him. So later on, he got charged with sexual offences against women because he put ads in local newspapers saying that he could do spiritual healing, and these women went to him and he sexually attacked them. And then he got charged with being an accessory to the murder of his ex-wife, who we know was brutally stabbed and set on fire in a unit block in Sydney's West. So gradually the charges against him became more serious, and he was also involved in some family court matters. So I had been aware of his activities for years, but it wasn't until I covered the Sydney siege inquest that I realised just how much he'd been on the radar of many authorities like ASIO. People had reported him to a hotline just days before the siege, and ASIO had deemed him not to be a threat. So that was quite gobsmacking to hear that evidence. It's not that they didn't look into him, they did, but they just deemed that he was harmless.
When you're doing your job, you're often abused by members of the public, which is something I didn't realise until I was talking to a female reporter at one of the TV networks, and she said, when she'll have to go out and cover crimes, she doesn't cover the court proceedings, but she'll cover a crime, and she'll be there doing her job, and people driving past, often kids, often young boys, will scream the most horrible abuse. What's that about?
Yes, look, I don't know. I think people perceive us as being predatory, and and this is something I ask in the book a little bit too about some of the cases. I say I came home today and I thought, what business are we in? Are we reporting the facts, or are we in the entertainment business, or is it a bit of both? And I think people get very angry about that. I've been called, what are some of the words without swearing, parasitic vermin I've had yelled at me. I've been spat on at one of the murder trials for the airport bikies. People just get very angry at the media because they see you as intruding on someone's private life, I think. And
I can understand that about people who are maybe being accused of crimes and would prefer not to be there. But in terms of people driving past and hurling abuse when you're waiting outside court, or you're just trying to do your job, what do you think motivates that? Just this idea that you're somehow feeding off someone else's misfortune?
I think so, and I think they probably don't know why we're there. They mightn't even know the case we're covering. They just see a group of reporters.
What do you see your role as?
I see my role as to report the facts accurately and fairly, and I see my role as being the eyes and ears of people in the public gallery, and I feel quite privileged that I'm in there because of these intimate details of people's lives that I'm hearing. I think the majority of the population can't be in the courtroom, so that's a responsibility for me, and it's my job to be objective and to report the facts as accurately as I can.
Well, I think we're very fortunate to have you there as our eyes and ears, and our words also in your book, The Court Reporter by Jamelle Wells. Congratulations on your book, and I highly recommend it. Probably the people who are driving past hurling abuse are also listening to true crime podcasts. So
thank you, Mia.
Congratulations. You can buy Jamelle's book, The Court Reporter, at apple.co/mamamia or in real life at any good bookstore. No Filter is produced by Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and I'll see you on the homepage, mamamia.com.au.